It was 12:18 a.m. when I heard the flatline. That sound, thin, clinical, almost polite, cut through the quiet corridor like someone tapping a metronome. For half a second I thought it was a YouTube video coming from the room next door. Then I remembered I wasn't watching anything. I was on the 3rd floor of a tired chain hotel, 3 rooms from the corner. The kind of place with brown carpeting, a microwave that hummed when you opened its door, and a single flickering sconce at the end of a long hallway. I'd been traveling for work all week, my head full of slides and the low-level dread you get from living out of a suitcase. At 11:30 p.m., I'd checked in, dropped my bag on the motel-style bed, brushed my teeth, and told myself I'd be asleep by midnight. By 11:45, an EMT crew's footsteps were padding past my door. I remember the gurney, because of how oddly small it looked in that hallway. In your head, a gurney is cinematic, but in real life, it's a narrow, practical thing with straps and a beige mattress that creaks. There were 2 EMTs and 1 paramedic, the paramedic barking the times into a radio while they rolled the gurney past. I peeked through the peephole, because you always do, right? And saw the silhouette of a person on the gurney, sheet pulled tight over them. The paramedic's gloved hands were precise. Compress, compress, compress. Someone was saying "clear" into a device, and for a beat that mechanical beep and tone of a monitor became the only rhythm in the hallway. The paramedic moved their hands in that pacing way people have when they're trying to keep hope and procedure in balance. Then the monitor spat out a flatline tone, a long, sustained note with no rise, no chance. It felt obscene, like an abrupt punctuation in the middle of an ordinary sentence. One EMT told me, politely but firm, to go back to my room. He put a hand up like he was giving a small apology. "Nothing to see, sir. Please go back to your room." I nodded. My keys were in my palm, and suddenly they felt cold and heavy. It was 12:18 when the flatline happened. Time I've kept with an odd kind of reverence, like a timestamp lodged behind my eyes. Later, when I told people about that night, the exactness of 12:18 was the thing that made them stop and listen. Maybe it's because numbers make memory feel more true, or maybe because that particular sound put a row of dominoes in motion. I went back to my room. I made tea I didn't drink. I told myself the noise would fade and I would sleep. Around 12:50 a.m., the corridor had thinned to a hush, broken only by the air conditioning units kicking on. That was when the knocking started. At first it was 3 soft, deliberate knocks. Not loud, almost as if the knocker was testing acoustics, tapping with a gloved knuckle to see what tone the door produced. 3 knocks. Tap, tap, tap. My brain catalogued them the way you tally items on a list. 3. Then silence, as if whoever had knocked was waiting for an answer that didn't come. My lamp was on. I looked at my phone. A message from work blinked on the screen. "Hope you're getting rest." I tried to laugh at myself. Imagine being startled by a polite code of 3 little taps in a hotel hallway, and then the handle depressed. There's a sensation people don't talk about, the slight give of a latch when someone tests the knob from the outside. It's a micro-movement, almost polite in its curiosity. The strip of light under my door, the thin halo spilled by the hallway sconce, went dark for a second, and then returned. Like someone had put a hand in front of a flashlight and then removed it. I sat very still. I had my phone on the armrest, the small, bright rectangle of the screen making the room feel less cave-like. The knocks came again, but louder, closer. 3 knocks in rapid succession, like a phrase repeated with more force. 3. I'm not a person who makes a big scene. I keep my breath even in tense moments, because freaking out is usually worse than sitting still and watching. But that night I remember how my pulse climbed anyway, how it seemed to migrate into my jaw and ears. I thought for a second of calling the front desk, of ducking to the peephole. I thought of the gun I legally carried in my bag for work trips. It's an uncomfortable fact to admit. And how, in a quiet hotel room at midnight, a loaded thing in a bag doesn't make you feel safer. It makes you feel like you might be forced into a decision you don't want to make. I cracked the door a fraction. There was a hallway, empty. No shoes, no shadow, no silhouette. I could hear voices down the hall. One of the EMTs was still there, talking in low tones with a hotel clerk, and the faint electric hum of the vending machine marked the distance. I slid the chain latch on and returned to my chair. Just as I sunk back, there was a scraping sound, as if something brushed the outside of the door, soft, like fabric against wood. The strip of light under the door went dark again, and this time I could have sworn it was longer. A breeze, a staff cart. I tried to tell myself every plausible thing and felt my own words sounding thin. At about 1:15 a.m., after I had turned on a million distractions, music low, a comedy show playing, the glow of a laptop, I heard footsteps approach that general echo in the corridor, the slow, irregular shuffle of someone not quite stable. The door to the room 3 doors down swung open with a soft clack. A man emerged and crossed the hallway. He was pale in the light, a little too pale, clinging to the hollowness under his cheekbones. He had the kind of tired eyes that looked like they'd weathered bad sleep for a long time, sunken, maybe blue in the shadow. He didn't look at me directly through the peephole. He glanced at his hands, at the wall, and then he spoke, clear enough that I could hear him through the slight gap of my door. "They don't always leave right away," he said. It was an odd sentence to hear in a hotel corridor. He spoke like someone explaining a minor social rule. He moved with the same slow deliberation as a person who'd been up for a long time. The thing that froze my blood wasn't that he was there. People were moving about, but that he came from the direction of the room where the EMTs had been pushing that gurney. I put my hand on the knob and felt foolish for it, as if any physical gesture could alter what was happening. I asked, softly, because what else do you say? "Are you okay?" He shrugged and looked at the door number over his shoulder. 3 doors away, in the flicker of the hall light, the number on the door read 312. When I asked later at the front desk in the pale light of breakfast how the paramedics could have been treating someone in room 312, the clerk looked at the log, at the little paper printout, and then frowned. "Room 312 was vacant," she said. "The last registered guest checked out yesterday." Her face had that professional blankness people use to make their work look less like anything personal. She checked the page again and read aloud, "Last charged out at 10 a.m. yesterday. No one since. No bell record." She tapped the screen as if numbers rearranged themselves differently for reality. I told her about the 3 knocks. I told her about the man from the room. She listened with the same polite attention until I was done, then told me there were stories and mix-ups all the time, misreads, wrong room numbers, people misremembering. Maybe someone else had been registering noise. Maybe the paramedics had been in the conference room. The explanations rolled out like washable paint, possible, plausible, soothing enough to smooth the immediate edges of my alarm. But the thing that soaked into me like a cold was the pattern. The Flatline at 12:18, the gurney, room 312, and then 3 knocks, twice, the brush against the door, the light under the door dimming, the man's offhand comment. 3 doors away, room 312. You learn after a night like that fear doesn't always arrive as a scream. Sometimes it turns into manners. I started counting doors when I walked into an elevator. I found myself noting numbers on hotel signage the way other people observe the weather. When I'm alone in a corridor now, I think of the strip of light under a door and how easily it can blink out. It's not rational to give a single sequence that much power. A string of coincidences is still coincidence, but rationality doesn't have a monopoly on how your body remembers. A week later, I replayed the sounds in my head and listened for the patterns. Flatline, tap, 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 tap. I even wrote the times down on a napkin in the airport before I boarded my plane. the numbers neat and small, as if making them into ink would make them less slippery. My travel colleague joked about ghost stories at a dinner that week. I nodded with the practiced smile of someone who had a strange thing to hide and didn't want to make it into a shared spectacle. I told close friends bits and pieces, watching their faces rearrange between concern and the polite incredulity you see when someone hears something they can't quite categorize. If you like these kinds of nightmares, hit subscribe. There's something almost selfish about hearing others' fear and feeling a quiet kinship, like you both bear small, private alarms, and it's why I tell these things out loud, because they are real, and because telling them makes the pulse change. The knock pattern stayed with me for days. It turned ordinary things into potential signposts, the sound of a kettle clicking off, the rhythm of a train in the distance, a door shutting in the hallway. Once, in a related but distant moment, I found myself 3 blocks from my apartment at 2 a.m., counting the number of lit windows on a building like it might tell me something useful. The habit lasted weeks, then months. It settled into a background hum, an anxiety I could live with that made no immediate danger but kept a low, persistent edge. That was the hotel. It felt private, contained, a single night that congealed into an uneasy anecdote. But the stories that follow are ones where the invasion ran deeper, where the pattern of unwanted access grew more aggressive. A man who ignored legal boundaries, a string of messages that started as a joke and ended with a stranger on your sidewalk. They stick in my head, not because they were unusual. People break rules, people stalk, people try and sometimes succeed in getting into private parts of your life, but because of how vulnerable those spaces are. A hotel room, a bedroom window, your message inbox, places you assume are just for you. Once someone learns the layout, everything changes. My roommate that year, Misty, was the kind of person who kept an immaculate kitchen and an even better attitude. She was small but loud, the sort of presence that filled our apartment with the smell of coffee and the sound of a playlist you could dance to while washing dishes. When she told me she'd filed a restraining order against Paul, her ex, I didn't get the gravity of it at first. We'd had roommate arguments about rent and plants, and whether the apartment closet was her domain or mine. Legal stuff felt abstract, like the kind of adult thing you knew existed without needing until you did. The restraining order felt like paperwork to me, a line on a calendar. To her, it was a cord she clung to because she was exhausted from fear. There were warning signs before the night the window got smashed. He would text, sometimes reasonable at first, then mixed with anger. A voice message where he said, "We can talk," followed by a terse note, "You promised you'd come back." She'd read them and toss her phone on the counter, pacing and saying, "He's been drinking. He can't leave his messages alone." I tried to be practical without minimizing. We set up a plan. Lock doors. Don't go out alone at night. Keep the exterior lights on. There is a terrible normality in developing protocols around the people who refuse your boundaries. On a Thursday night, when the city had a cold wind that smelled like wet leaves and cheap pizza, Misty banged on my door at 2:14 a.m. Her face was streaked with mascara. Her hair was half untamed. She was breathing hard. "He smashed the window," she said, voice sharp and flattened at the same time. "He threw my clothes in and—" She couldn't finish. Rage and fear make language a blunt instrument. We ran through the checklist. Call 911. Get to a safe place. She was panicked but steady enough to talk. Her phone lit up with messages from Paul. Short, furious. "Open up. You owe me. You can't hide." The texts weren't particularly original. They'd been the kind of exchanges they'd both had when the breakup turned ugly. But receiving someone's raw, panic-filled prose at 2 a.m. is a different animal than reading about it at noon. They sounded elastic, the way texts do, sent not in calm, but in bursts of someone trying to seize the present. I called 911. The operator asked the usual things: location, nature of emergency, and then asked whether anyone was injured. Misty said no. The dispatcher told me an officer would be on the way. We sat in the living room wrapped in a blanket and watched the glow of the apartment light on the window where the pane had been tapped, not smashed entirely, but cracked into a spiderweb of hairline fractures. Later, someone told me that people underestimate how personal a window is. You forget how much it frames your life until you see glass broken and the world suddenly more accessible. Paul's texts changed tone. At first they were demanding, then there were images, snatches of photos he'd somehow salvaged, maybe from a dresser or a pile of clothes. "You're all mine," one text read. He promised vague retribution. We kept the messages, because evidence is a strange salve. Misty sat on the couch with her knees up and pressed her thumb to the screen until the case cooled her palm. I boiled water and made too much tea. The police were not immediately present. There is procedural time that exists in its own bubble between the moment you report and the moment someone appears. You find, in those pockets, that the mind races worse than the body. We double-checked the locks, put chairs against accessible windows, and sent a neighbor a quick text to ask if they could keep watch. The first responding unit arrived, finally, at around 2:55 a.m. 2 officers in Navy uniforms moved through our small apartment with the kind of efficiency that is either comforting or blunt, depending on your mood. They took statements, asked for addresses and names, and wrote bits of our lives down on forms. I envied their pens. Everything they touched seemed to gain authority. When they asked if Paul had ever threatened physical harm, Misty nodded and produced messages like evidence laid on a kitchen table. One officer made a few calls. There was the tonality of urgency and the clack of a radio. We sat in the living room as one officer walked through logs on a tablet, another arranging a kind of human geography of the night. Where Paul lived, how many prior calls had been placed, whether he'd been served the restraining order. The night hummed with the noise of procedural care. At about 3 a.m., the officers went to search the apartment. They checked closets, because people do hide in benches, and coat racks in the strangest ways. I remember the surreal little tableau of one officer opening the closet door and reaching inside, like you expect them to find shoes or a lost blanket. The room smelled like coffee and the faint chemical edge of cleaning supplies, ordinary apartment smells that make your chest half relax, because this must still be a home. He opened the closet. There are moments when time does what a camera does. It slows and makes every second thick. I remember seeing the officer's fingers run along a hanger, the scrape of plastic on wood. And then, in the narrow angle where my living room met the closet, a figure moved. He'd come back. Paul was standing there like he'd always been a piece of the apartment. Messy hair, pale skin, eyes like the empty sockets you'd see on someone who hasn't slept for days. He hadn't made a sound. He simply unveiled himself from the closet where he'd been hiding, and the world condensed into his face and our reactions. For a second there were no words, just small noises. The soft rustle of fabric, the quick intake of breath from Misty, the officer's hand moving toward his belt. Paul looked at me and said her name like he'd been rehearsing it in a mirror. "You're overreacting," he said, but the sentence had no force beyond the pattern of his speech. It was a flat intonation grafted onto a dangerous behavior. He reached as if for a vape he thought was in a pocket, his hands searching the air like someone uncertain of his grip. The officer moved, polite but firm. "Sir, step away," he said. The world felt like a freeze frame on a bad television show until the officer's voice threaded threads of color back into the night. The authority in his voice, the word arrest. The small, practical words that do the heavy lifting when boundaries are crossed. It is a strange relief when someone steps in and turns a chaotic human moment into rules and process. There was a brief resistance, shouts, the sound of someone's sneakers skidding across linoleum. but it was over before it felt like a battle. Paul was handcuffed. There were murmurs. "You're under arrest." The clack of metal, the officer reading rights in a way that seemed both rote and necessary. The arrest came at about 3:12 a.m., a time rattled into the night's record book, neat and official now. We watched him go. After the officers left with Paul in custody, there was an odd quiet. The adrenaline didn't evaporate, so much as go numb, like an arm falling asleep. Misty sat down on the couch and cried in relief first, then exhaustion. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Outside, the city was still doing its long, indifferent breath of air. The police wrote a report, made referrals, explained the next steps toward enforcing the restraining order. They were professional and efficient and human in a way that made their presence less about theater and more about scaffolding. Even with that scaffolding in place, the emotional bruise didn't heal with the tap of handcuffs. The knowledge that someone had been inside her closet, inside the private geometry of her apartment, left a different kind of ache. Restraining orders are paper shields, and paper is fragile when someone is willing to step over it. In the days after, Misty rearranged furniture, changed locks, and signed up for a self-defense class. She was calm in the way people are when they want to look okay for the record, but the little things surprised her. The way a routine at home could be interrupted with a crash, the way a phone could light up with an image and bring the past back into vivid focus. I remember sitting with her a few nights later, the quiet apartment lit only by the kitchen light, and she told me, "I thought it would stop when I filed. I really did." There was no accusation in it, only a sad surprise. You imagine that paperwork equals safety. Sometimes it does, sometimes it helps, and sometimes it's a start that still needs enforcement. Paul was charged that night. He was taken away. The legal machine churned and produced forms and dates and court hearings. But the feeling of someone else's hands having been in your closet, lodged in a place that paper couldn't touch. That night, I learned how quickly domestic spaces could be breached, how ordinary objects, hangers, vapes, windows, become props in a scene you never agreed to star in. I learned how the state's intervention can be both a rescue and an administrative process that doesn't always scrub away the residue of fear. For Misty, the arrest was necessary and right, and yet the city had shown us how imperfect its shield can be. If the first story, Room 312 and its 3 knocks, was about the uncanny intrusion into a rented, transient space, Misty's night was about the violence of someone who refused to respect legal boundaries in your own home. They are cousins of the same thing, your private life laid open by someone else's insistence. After the police left and Paul was in custody, there was a long silence filled with small sounds, the clink of a spoon in a cup, the low hum of the refrigerator. We tried to sleep. I don't remember exactly when I finally did, only that sleep felt thin and fragile. In the morning there was the paperwork, the officer's card left on the counter, the smell of bleach as the caretaker came to secure the window. There were messages from friends and family, and an outpouring of practical support that was kind and awkward in equal measure. Later that week, I walked Misty to the courthouse for a hearing and watched how her shoulders tensed and then uncoiled as procedural things happened. Paperwork was signed. A judge read a statement. Paul might have pled or not. Sometimes legalities have their own glacial pace. The important part, at least at first, was that a formal measure existed that could be enforced if need be. But enforcement is not the same as erasure. The presence of him crouched in her closet stayed with her in little ways. A reluctance to open the closet door in the dark, a habit of checking rooms twice before falling asleep, a tendency to keep lights on. She had scars that paperwork couldn't see. The aftermath wasn't melodrama. It was mundane and persistent. Misty returned to work. She made jokes about being a domestic warrior and then would nod and go quiet for a half second. Friends checked in. The city offered a number for survivor resources, the kind of list that feels both like care and bureaucracy. It was the sort of thing that rearranged the map of her life without her permission. And somewhere in that reshaped map, I kept noticing how fragile our assumptions about safety were. You lock doors, you file orders, you call the police, yet people still find ways to get in. Habits shift, sleep is thinned. There is a long tail of unease that follows these things, like an undertow you can feel, but not always see. I ended up staying with Misty for a few nights after the arrest because sleep felt braver in numbers. We made plans, call lists, safe words, a friend who would drop by if we texted a code. They were practical and small and felt necessary. The neighborhood watch checked in. There were little triumphs, a new lock installed, a courted apology that came over the phone and landed like nothing at all. But even triumphant things were tinted by the memory of vulnerability. The night Paul was taken was the close of one chapter in that story, but not the closing of everything that followed. There are procedural things that still unfold even after cuffs click. Court dates, restraining order renewals, the slow drip of evidence into systems that sometimes function perfectly and sometimes do not. For us, it was a wake-up call. That private spaces are porous, and that the legal protections we imagine as walls can be a temporary curtain at best. If that unsettles you, good, because the third story is one that has the kind of creeping intimacy that invades not a building, but your head and your online life. It begins small, like a game, and grows into something that follows across platforms until a stranger knows a way to find you in public. It teaches you how a single message can be the hinge that opens a life you thought private. When I was 18 and moving into university accommodation, I thought the world was built of conveniences and shared laundries and a lot of polite small talk. I got a random message on Instagram from someone with a new account. Friendly, jokey, a suggestion to play truth or dare to make small talking less boring. It was the kind of thing you might say in the dorm room to be funny. I did it as a joke. I didn't think much of it. The first exchange was banal, questions about majors, a joke, a dare to take a goofy photo. Then the questions turned oddly specific. The person messaged, "Which corridor are you on?" I blinked. I hadn't mentioned my building. I told them the corridor number as a joke, thinking the person was playing along. The reply was a little too informed. "Oh, that's the one with the laundry room that smells like bleach at midnight. Your room's on the left if you're facing the elevators, right?" I hadn't told anyone that. The message read like someone standing in my stairwell with a camera pointed inward. Connor, my friend, told me to block the account and then laugh it off. Probably some bored freshman, he said, but the humor was hollow. The stranger's knowledge included the name of the cafe near campus I'd told a friend about one time, a detail I assumed had died with the conversation. There was no proof that it was anything malicious yet. But a joke that knows your small domestic geography stops feeling like a joke quickly. I tried to trace where the account had come from. Old profiles, no followers, a handful of posts. It reappeared and reappeared. At 18, you learn fast how public things can be, even when you think they're private. People you hadn't met could find you. You learn that digital footprints are less like steps in sand and more like neon signs that someone can follow. 2 years later, when I was more cautious and less naive, the account came back, this time across platforms. Instagram, then TikTok. Messages moved from playful to intimate to downright invasive. Photos started arriving, pictures that seemed to be from places I'd been. The bench near the student center where I liked to eat, the library table I reserved for exam week. They were small things, but they implied someone had been paying attention. Along with the photos came alternations of friendliness and hostility. "Miss you," 1 minute, "you never should have left" the next. The cadence was deliberate, like someone practicing pressure. I blocked and blocked and blocked again. You can build privacy walls, lock accounts, change usernames, delete photos, but privacy is porous when someone is focused. They created throwaway profiles, reached out to people I knew, and then disappeared, only to reappear with new methods. The messages included screenshots, things that proved knowledge I shouldn't have thought someone could gather. You get into a paranoid loop. Who saw what? Which friend told which detail? Was there someone in the laundry room watching? The doubt is part of the torment. Friends told me to take screenshots, to document everything, which felt both practical and hollow. Evidence is a necessary currency when institutions need to intervene, but it's also a strange thing to gather when what you want more than anything is just to not have your life sifted. I kept a folder, I kept copies, I learned the legal language slowly: harassment, stalking, unwanted contact. The process of naming what was happening made it less nebulous, but no less terrifying. The contact escalated, messages that were impossible to classify, a photo of a street corner near my apartment with the caption, "Near you," DMs that included things I had never posted, a favorite shirt, a joke I had only made in person. By then, I had a friend, Connor, who kept an eye on me and walked me across campus at odd hours. He knocked on wood when he could. We developed rituals: text me when you get to your dorm, call me when you're home. Small protocols that felt idiotic and necessary at the same time. And then the encounter happened, the kind you rehearse for, as if rehearsal could replace coincidence. It was a walk home on a night that was not even particularly late. I was thinking about a lecture, about a reading that made me feel older than 18. There were footsteps behind me that matched mine for a few blocks. When I turned, the face from the photographs looked up and met mine, and the man smiled in the quiet way someone does when they recognize an old contact. "Hey," he said. He said my name like someone flipping through a file and finding the right page. I ran. I don't remember sprinting so much as the sensation of all my limbs agreeing to move fast for me. I unlocked my apartment, locked the door, and sat with my back leaning hard against the wood, as if the solid knot of it could keep whatever had found me outside. Police were called. People searched. There were statements. The man wasn't captured that night. You breathe differently after that. Your walk home is redesigned. You take different streets. You change your habits until they feel like armor. The police suggest a restraining order. You start the process, but the question of how someone tracked you from a jokey message to a sidewalk is a kind of mystery that keeps gnawing. Which digital crumbs did I leave? Which small confession did I make that became a map? The point isn't to blame yourself. It's merely to note how, with small pieces of information, someone can build a very specific knowledge of you. Your roots, your timings, the way you like to carry a bag. The intimacy of stalking is mechanical and steady. It's not always cinematic. It's incremental. It is a voice that won't quiet and a presence that presses against your life until you're reshaping everything to avoid the pressure. That night, when I ran and the man on the street used my name and I felt my chest dislodge into a run, was the moment everything went from unpleasant to urgent. It forced the issue into the real world. You can block accounts, but people can be present in the very air you breathe. It taught me the difference between a cyberspace breach and someone who knows which bench you like to sit on at noon. The cases I'm telling are stitched together by the same nasty thread. The private spaces, whether a hotel room, your bedroom, or your online accounts, can be violated in ordinary human ways. Authorities can help. Restraining orders can do things. But people find ways to cross lines, and sometimes the record of what happened is the small, stubborn evidence we cling to as we try to sleep without feeling watched. When I sat down to write these things down, the details came back as images. The flatline at 12:18, the 3 knocks, the man with hollow eyes at room 312, the smashed window at 2:14 in Misty's room, and the closet where Paul had been hiding. The Instagram that started as a joke and ended with the man greeting me by name on my street. They replay in my head, not as neat endings, but as loops, as things that wedge themselves in and then ripple outward. They are not cinematic ghosts. They are human intruders, with all the mundanity and menace of people who think the world owes them entrance. There's more to tell about the online case, about the weeks and months of documentation, about the call with the detective who told me not to delete anything, about the way a restraining order moves through an institution. There is more to tell about how Misty rebuilt her sense of home, the small rituals she used to reclaim a closet as her own. There are more fragments to the hotel story, the small later moments when an offhand remark from a clerk made me question if I'd misremembered something or if someone else had a piece I didn't see. But even as I keep writing, I find these nights refuse tidy conclusions. They retain an open-endedness that haunts the margins of everyday life. The way you find yourself checking the peephole one more time, the way you don't want to be alone in a hallway, the way certain numbers will ring in your head. The stories are not tales that end neatly. They are little thefts of certainty. Someone touches your map, and some of the lines never go back. If you've read this far, you already know the patterns I'm circling. Soft knocks that multiply, windows left braced against the night, the scrape of a shoe on a sidewalk that used to be anonymous. These are not horror movies. They are real, messy, bureaucratic and human. They are annoyances and dangers and paperwork and bravery, all tangled together. And if the first two of these stories made you feel a little colder, wait until you hear the full arc of the third, the one that began as a game and moved through DMs and screenshots to a moment on the sidewalk when a stranger said my name. That one opens into a longer, slower grind of evidence and fear, and it is not a neat thing to resolve, but I will tell it, because we owe ourselves the names of the things that shifted us. For now, there are small practicalities, screenshots saved, locks changed, police reports filed. There are friends who called in the night, coffee that got cold, and a memory of a man whose eyes looked like dark rooms. There is a habit, in the wake of all this, of counting doors and checking the number on a room, of watching the light under a door and noting when it goes dark. It is not a life anyone would choose, but it's the life we ended up with after these moments. And it is a life that continues, with the questions still asking for answers. I want to know if this has ever happened to you, if you've sat with a pounding heart after a knock that shouldn't have been there, or if someone's messages turned into a map of your days. Write it down. Tell someone. There's some safety in shared stories. And if you're still here, if you want more of these accounts, I have the third one, and it is the slowest, quietest kind of terror. It starts small, and by the time it's visible, the balance of your life has shifted in ways you never expected. I told myself for a while that the paperwork and screenshots would be enough. I learned the language of evidence the way you learn a survival skill. Timestamp, screenshot, metadata, chain of custody. The detective who called me spoke slowly, as if saying things slowly could steady the mind that had been rattled by digital intimacies. "Do not delete anything," he said, and it sounded less like advice and more like a tiny ritual that held a chance of consequence. He asked me to forward messages to an email, to print what I could, to bring a phone to the station if I could. There was a kind of grim choreography to it: collect, label, wait. When I went in, the station smelled like coffee and old paper, the institutional aroma of things that function by forms. The officer at the desk was younger than I expected, wearing a tired expression and a badge that betrayed more fatigue than authority. He clicked through my screenshots with a mouse and nodded as if he was assembling a puzzle box whose pieces he didn't want to force. "We can try to trace the accounts," he said. He didn't promise much, which was honest and also the worst kind of realism, something like, "We'll do what we can." There were forms to sign, an evidence number assigned, a detective's card that felt like the only tangible ally in the process. The first week after the street encounter stretched and slowed. I moved like a person who had learned to minimize their signature. I avoided the bench near the student center where I'd once eaten sandwiches and read. I stopped taking the street that cut through the park, the one with the lone lamppost where I'd once liked to stop and check messages. Every familiar place acquired the potential for recognition. I kept my keys between my fingers like an unspoken weapon. Messages continued, not always immediate but persistent, like the tide reaching the same sandbar. He would pop up with a new profile, then another, and sometimes he'd be coy, a shadow account with one follower. Sometimes there were pictures that made my skin crawl, a shot of a window I'd once leaned out of to smoke, a photo of the campus sign, snapped at dusk, angles that matched the precise place I sat when I read. The photos were never explicit evidence of being watched in that particular moment, but they were precise enough to imply surveillance. They were curated to let me know he knew where I went and what I liked. Connor became a fixture in the margins of all of it. He'd walk me to class, pretend not to glance when I checked behind me. He brought practicality, extra charges, a flashlight app, a deadpan ability to joke when everything else felt brittle. He'd say things that, spoken by a friend, changed the texture of a grim situation. "You didn't make this," he'd tell me. "Someone obsessed did." That sentence was useful because it split the world into clearer pieces, me and someone else with a problem. It was not comforting, but it was delineating. The detective was methodical. He explained, as gently as an officer can, that digital footprints are messy and ephemeral, that IP addresses can be rerouted, that accounts can be ghosted. He asked for the type of proof that could lead to a subpoena, server logs, the kind of back-end records only companies provide under court order. That meant time and forms and, potentially, a long wait if the person was careful. He told me what he could do immediately. Document the harassment, ask for surveillance footage along routes, and what he couldn't promise, arrest without more actionable evidence. The conversation had the two tracks of the modern era, one of legal possibility and one of human limitation. There were mornings I woke with my phone on the nightstand and checked it with a dread that made my hands tremble. Notifications that should have been trivial, updates from campus, a calendar reminder, felt like mine, but not. Even the act of sleeping became strategic. A phone across the room, lights angled to avoid shadows, small rituals that made the room look less easy to approach. I became careful with language, avoiding phrases in public that might be overheard and repeated back as breadcrumbs. The world contracted into a map of what I could control. At some point, the stalker started to use other people's timelines to get to me. He would comment on posts from mutual acquaintances with little attachments, references to something he said he'd liked, a mention of my favorite drink at the campus cafe. It felt like a puppet show where the strings were invisible and the puppets were my friends. I called one of them, a girl named Elena, and asked bluntly if she'd ever told anyone about the bench I liked. She was hurt and confused, and her hurt felt as raw as my own, because it reminded me how intrusive this behavior spread outward like oil. Her account of the exchange was honest. She'd never said anything to anyone beyond our mutual group chat. That only tightened the noose of options. Either someone in the circle had told, or the stalker had paid attention in ways we'd never imagined. Sometimes the harassment had a peculiar, almost ritualistic tone. A message would arrive at a particular hour, 3:17 a.m. became one of those hours, and it would be a line referencing a class I had on Tuesdays, or the name of a song I had hummed in a coffee shop once. Those small, deliberate symmetries were designed to unsettle, a way of saying, without stating it outright, that the person had tracked the rhythm of my life. I tried to be brave in practical ways. I took screenshots. I organized them into folders labeled by date. I printed out a packet and handed it to the detective. The act of printing made the messages feel heavier and also more real. I remember carrying that folder back to my dorm like it was a book of instructions, pages that when read could make the dots connect in ways maybe someone in authority could use. The detective said he'd request metadata from platforms. There were promises of subpoenas and, if needed, cooperation from tech companies. There was also the honest admission that some accounts vanish and others re-emerge with new names, and thus the chase can be endless. In the weeks after the sidewalk encounter, campus security put out a general advisory. Be aware of your surroundings, report suspicious contacts. It was a polite dispatch in the college newsletter, not a siren. The advisory made a few people more watchful and left others with the same weary shrug that circulates when institutions issue notices for everything but the very specific danger. I remember feeling both grateful for the bulletin and small inside it, as if bureaucracy could not quite hold the shape of what had happened to me. The most unsettling part was the sense that no matter how much documentation you build, the next moment could still be a surprise. Once, late in autumn, Connor and I were walking back from a library session, and he nudged me because he spotted a man ahead. The man's jacket was too thin for the cold, and he walked like he was following a rhythm tuned to someone else's. My breath caught, and I felt the old electric fear tighten behind my ribs. He must have noticed us glance. The man turned his head as if to meet any eye, and then he moved off in a different direction. To this day, I don't know if he was connected to those messages or just another person with a private life. But my body read the scene in a binary way. Potential threat, potential safety. Nothing in between. We pursued the restraining order option because it felt like building a formal boundary that could be enforced later if needed. The process involved forms, a hearing date, and an attempt to serve papers. Serving the order felt ceremonial, a piece of paper that says, in legal language, stay away. It was both a comfort and an imperfect shield. It requires the person to obey out of the force of law, but it cannot, by itself, prevent someone who is determined from locating you. The detective explained this with a frankness that was both protective and realistic. Arrest requires probable cause. Civil protections require willingness of witnesses and the machinery of courts. The legal system offered scaffolding. It did not promise a hermetic seal. There were moments when I resented the way my life contracted into reports and court dates. My identity, once a simple collection of classes and friends and late-night readings, became a dossier. The paperwork that was supposed to give me power also turned my memories into exhibits. The act of converting fear into forms had the curious effect of making the experience more legible and somehow less private. It was necessary, but it felt like a small theft. The intimacy of my life had been parceled into documents. Therapy helped in ways I hadn't predicted. Sitting in a small room across from someone trained to listen, naming the unease as something with a structure, stalking, harassment, violation, made it feel less like a private failing and more like an external force to be understood. A therapist taught me to notice the small triumphs, walking without scanning the whole horizon, sleeping through light traffic noise, and to credit myself for them. Coping strategies crept in, not going to the same seat every time at the cafe, changing routine routes without dramatizing it, learning better privacy settings. These were not cures, they were compromises. After months of paperwork and waiting, the detective called to say they'd gotten a cooperation order from one platform that yielded a location attached to one of the suspect accounts. It was a small victory, a node in a web. But the node didn't point neatly to a single person like an arrow. It pointed to a rough area with apartment buildings and transient residents. The detective explained that they were following leads, requests for more documentation, subpoenas for logs, but the sense of absolute closure remained far away. Sometimes the stalker would lapse into silence for weeks, then re-emerge with a flourish. A new account, a cleverer photo, a mention of a song I liked. The pattern of attention and withdrawal had a rhythm I could predict in a way that made it both maddening and insidious. You start to measure your life in intervals of worry and relative peace. There were nights I screamed into a pillow and others where I sat in silence until dawn. Friends brought dinners, texted to check, and sometimes the small, steadying presence of their normal lives felt like a lifeline. There were also moments of shame, irrational and heavy, where I wondered if I had done something to invite attention. Those thoughts were worthless and cruel, and my friends were stern in correcting them. It helps to have people who call the behavior what it is: harassment, not flirting, not a compliment. Ultimately, the restraining order process moved forward in fits and starts. Court dates were scheduled and rescheduled. An officer came by to make a new report after another message slipped through. The person I believed had been the stalker was questioned, released, or sometimes not located at all. Legal outcomes that are messy and frustrating, and often unsatisfying. I learned to live in the uncertainty. I learned to walk with my pulse a little quicker and my shoulders a little tighter, to derive small victories from mundane things. A friend waiting up until I got home, a neighbor calling to say they'd noticed someone loitering, a block of messages that finally stopped for a breath. I don't have a neat ending for you. There are nights I still check the peephole, the old numbers in my head, a private metronome. I still avoid the bench sometimes, but I also still meet friends for coffee, go to lectures, read in the library. Life is a compromise between caution and ordinary pleasures, and that is perhaps its own small defiance. The man who once called my name on a sidewalk never found a way to fold my life into something he could fully own. He left marks, no doubt, habits reshaped, trust retuned, but he didn't get everything he wanted. When I think about all three tales, the knocks in the hotel, Misty's closet, the slow terror of being watched online, the same awful logic threads them together. A person exploits a gap in space or system and asserts presence. The hotel is a rented room supposed to be private for a night. A window is a frame of domestic sanctuary that, when breached, makes a home feel porous. An inbox and a sidewalk map your life in ways you thought private. Each intrusion repurposes ordinary things. 3 polite knocks, a closet, a harmless message, until they are instruments of control. Institutional responses helped and sometimes failed. The paramedics couldn't explain everything about the corridor. The officers who came to Misty's apartment did the right thing and cleaned up the immediate danger, but the legal world afterwards still required time and patience and made no promises. The detective who took my case was diligent but candid about limits. These systems offer tools, a badge, a paper order, a subpoena, but they are not magic. They are frameworks that can be painfully slow to move against someone who is focused and patient. And then there are the after effects, the ways a person recalibrates. We learn to sleep with one eye metaphorically open, to count doors, to check numbers, to keep keys ready. We build small rituals that feel like armor. We write down times and save screenshots. We practice telling the story again and again until the edges are less raw. We trade the illusion of unquestioned safety for a more complicated, careful life. If any of this resonates with you, if you've had small invasions that multiplied into bigger fears, write it in the comments. Tell us how you managed, what helped, what felt like too little. Sharing does not undo the past, but it stitches us into a community with more knowledge and more empathy. These are true stories, not because they are dramatic all the time, but because they are ordinary ways the world can get in. They haunt not with ghosts, but by demonstrating how thin the line between privacy and exposure can be. If you've stayed this long, and these tales made you check the door one more time, then they're doing what they were meant to do, making the invisible things visible. If you want more true accounts like these, stories that linger in the corners and change the way we move, subscribe and tell someone who needs to hear they're not alone. I will keep telling them, because knowledge, in the end, is a small kind of protection. And if you ever hear 3 soft knocks in a quiet hallway, or the scatter of someone rifling in a closet, or a message that knows where you sat last Tuesday, remember it is okay to record it, to tell someone, to insist that institutions act. You don't have to make sense of it alone. The haunting, for all its persistence, is a thing we can name together.